Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Sophie Lowe, and I'm the Director of Visitor Services and Program Management at the Museum at Eldridge Street. I am so thrilled to be welcoming you all to our virtual program this evening on Magic, Mourners, and Healers, Jewish Women in the Shtetls and Contemporary Art. This program coincides with our current exhibition, Every Protection, showcasing works by artist Debra Olin. Now, before I introduce our curator, I invite all of you to visit us in person to the museum at Eldridge Street on the Lower East Side. We are offering both guided and self-guided tours right now, and also walking tours, all at a limited capacity for the health and safety of everyone. But you'll be able to take in truly breathtaking architecture and learn about an important piece of American immigration history. So first, I'd like to welcome Nancy Johnson, our curator, who will be introducing our speaker today. And after the program, we will have some time for Q&A. Your microphones are currently muted, so you'll be able to ask your questions via the chat box, and then we'll get to them at the very end. So Nancy, why don't we get started?
Okay, thank you very much, Sophie. I'm so pleased to welcome Professor Nathaniel Deutsch this evening for a very special talk. What brings us all together tonight is the current exhibition at the Museum of work by printmaker Debra Olin. The show is entitled Every Protection, Folk Culture and Motherhood in the Jewish Pale of Settlement. Back in 2008, Professor Deutsch wrote an article in Pak and Traeger, the magazine of the Yiddish Book Center. The article described the work of S. Ansky, a Russian ethnographer who undertook a research project he called the Jewish Ethnographic Program. Ansky wanted to document folk traditions and beliefs in Eastern European communities. When Debra read about Ansky's work, especially about the questionnaire he formulated, it captivated her imagination. Debra was especially interested in Ansky's observations about pregnancy and childbirth, and she contacted Nathaniel Deutsch to find out more. He, in turn, was captivated by her artwork and her interest in Yiddish culture and language. And so a collaboration began, and Debra created a new series of artwork based on Ansky's intriguing questions. In 2011, Professor Deutsch arranged for Debra Olin to show her new Every Protection series at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where he is a faculty member. The catalog for this show, which includes a fascinating essay by Professor Deutsch, is available on Debra's website. Fast forward 6 or 7 years when Debra came to visit the museum at Eldridge Street. Our exhibition program was then still quite new, and she sent us the catalog for the Santa Cruz show, thinking that her Every Protection series might be a good fit for the museum. I agreed. Not only was her work beautiful, it also offered a way to look at the traditions and beliefs of the early congregants of the Eldridge Street Synagogue, which is the museum's landmark home. It took another few years with COVID intervening to mount the show, but finally in mid-October last year, we hung Debra's work, including a new installation called From the Oral Torah that she created just for our exhibition. Debra suggested that we invite Nathaniel Deutsch to give this talk tonight. Her collaboration with him was an integral part of the process of creating the works we are showing, and his knowledge of Ansky's work is unparalleled. After the article that so intrigued Debra, he wrote The Jewish Dark Continent, Life and Death in the Russian Pale of Settlement, the 2011 book that became the touchstone for putting together our exhibition. Last year, The Lost World of Russia's Jews, Ethnography and Folklore in the Russian Pale of Settlement was published. This book, which is a collaboration with Noah Barrera, is a translation from the Yiddish of an account of a researcher who was part of the Ansky expedition. His many other books include The Maiden of Ludmir, A Jewish Holy Woman and Her World. And just this morning, it was announced that his most recent book, written with Michael Casper and entitled A Fortress in Brooklyn, Race, Real Estate, and the Making of Hasidic Williamsburg, has been awarded a 2021 National Jewish Book Award from the Jewish Book Council. He comes to us tonight from Santa Cruz, where the weather is much nicer than here. There he is the Baumgarten Endowed Professor of Jewish Studies at the University of California. Please welcome Nathaniel Deutsch.
Thank you very much, Nancy, for that wonderful introduction, and also Sophie for all of the work that you did to make this happen. And last but certainly not least, Debra Olin, whose really extraordinary art has inspired me so much. And I'll be talking about the relationship between the folklore, the ethnography, and the art that Debra has done recently a little bit later in my remarks. I tried to choose a background that's professorial with the books. Those are real books, not just a sort of fake background. I promise not to show what's outside. For those of you who are in Maine, I see there's somebody in Maine here, Harlem, Chicago, various places in the north that may be having snow right now because the ocean is right out here and there are sailboats and surfers and things like that. So Santa Cruz is known as surfing capital of the United States and also the capital of Shtetl research, a little less known at least I've tried to contribute to that. So what I'm going to talk about today is one particular aspect of research that was begun around 100 years ago in the Shtetls, or what are called market towns in English, of Eastern Europe. So these were towns in which a large proportion of the population was Jewish. They shared the towns typically with members of other ethnicities, Poles, Ukrainians, Belarusians, depending on where, and so on, depending on where they were. And my remarks today are going to focus on some of the folk culture and traditions that existed in the Jews in these towns, and even more specifically on women's traditions. Before I get into the specifics of that, I want to frame my remarks in a broader sense of Jewish history. One of the reasons why the research that was done by Ansky, who I'll introduce a little bit more in a few minutes, and others starting around 100 years ago was so important and in its day radical, was because until that time, Jewish folk traditions in general, and Jewish women's experience and lives in particular, were almost completely absent from the historical record, from the historical works that were being produced about Jewish life and the Jewish past. It's as if 50%, roughly, right, of the entire Jewish population didn't exist if you were to just look at the vast majority of written sources on Jews' lives at that time. Moreover, very few things were written or documented regarding the lives of everyday Jews, not the rabbinic elite or not the wealthy. So on the one hand, we have work that was done up until this point, and this point I'm talking about the first few decades of the 20th century, which almost invariably focused on the political leaders or the religious leaders and so on, and was, because of that too, was almost exclusively about Jewish men. So Ansky, which was actually a pseudonym that was taken on by somebody named Shlomo Zalman Rappaport, who was himself from a shtetl in the Russian Empire. He was a pioneer in a number of ways. Many of you, if you've ever heard of him at all, know him because he, among other things, wrote a play called The Dybbuk, which became a famous movie. In fact, it's probably the most widely produced Jewish play in the history of Jewish theater. He was a songwriter, he was a political revolutionary, a socialist revolutionary, and he was also an ethnographer, meaning He decided in around 1912 to go out into the field, into what was then known as the Russian Pale of Settlement. This was this vast territory between the Baltic and the Black Seas, in which millions of Jews in the Russian Empire were restricted. Okay. Prior to the Russian Revolution, the large majority of Jews in the Russian Empire had to live in this territory. They couldn't live, for example, in Russia proper, but instead they lived in these towns and cities in the Pale of Settlement. And they constituted in 1900 the largest Jewish population in the world, 40% of the world's Jews, roughly 5 million people. And most Jews in the United States today have at least some ancestry from the Russian Empire, because many of those Jews, for a variety of reasons, having to do with pogroms, having to do with economic decline, having to do with political discrimination, having to do with seeking greater opportunities, immigrated to the United States from the Russian Empire. Roughly 2 million did between 1880 and 1924, when the Immigration Restriction Act greatly restricted immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe, along with Asian restriction acts that were passed in roughly the same period to limit immigration from those parts of the world. So this was a tremendously important site for Jewish life. And it was one that was largely off the radar from formal or official accounts of Jewish history. Ansky decides in 1912, as I mentioned, that he's going to visit many of these Shtetls, or as many of the Shtetls as he can in person, and document the life on the ground. He assembles a team of people to accompany him, a photographer, a musicologist, and some young former yeshiva students, meaning young men who were trained, who were educated in traditional Jewish schools and knew a tremendous amount about Jewish customs and Jewish law. Why was that important? Because Ansky wanted to document those things as they were actually experienced, not just as they were written about in books. Now, one thing to note is that Ansky and all the other people who were on his ethnographic team were men. So he didn't have any women accompanying him on the team. And yet, Ansky was perhaps the first, or certainly among the first people to become interested in and to seek to document the lives of Jewish women and not just the Jewish men in these Shtetls. And so even though the whole ethnographic team was men, they also sought to document the lives of Jewish women, which posed certain challenges. So I want to start by talking about one of the episodes that was recorded by Avram Rechtman, who was one of the people who accompanied Ansky. He was one of the yeshiva students, the yeshiva bochers, as you'd say in Yiddish, and who later wrote a memoir about it. And he described going to a town called Kremenitz. And in this town was an old woman who had a large family. She had many children and they had children. And she was old enough to remember a lullaby that had been sung to a Hasidic holy man roughly a century before. The problem was there is a Jewish law that women are not supposed to sing in public. They're not supposed to sing before men, I should say. It's considered immodest. It's called kol isha. It's a prohibition. So you have these male ethnographers. How are they going to record? How are they going to hear this woman singing this song? First, you could also ask, how are they going to record it? Well, the way they recorded it is they actually had wax cylinder recording equipment, Edison wax cylinder recording equipment. It was considered, the most technologically advanced recording equipment of the time. And they brought it into the field with them. It was like a big phonograph that they could record sound with. And they made recordings ultimately of hundreds of songs, of jokes, of stories, etc. The thing is, they wanted to record this old woman and she didn't want to sing in front of them. So what they did was they had her sing to her younger female relatives in one room, and they sat in another room. And because they were separate, the women felt that that was okay. What they didn't know was that Ansky was actually recording them with this equipment. He didn't tell them that in advance. And when they found that out, they were actually quite upset. There was another class of women. One of the things that Ansky did on this expedition, which he undertook for 3 seasons. So there were 3 seasons of what became known as the Jewish ethnographic expedition. They would go in the summertime because in the winter, the mud was so impassable that they really couldn't travel from town to town. They ultimately, over the course of 3 summers, visited 70 communities. Okay. And in those 70 communities, they came across a number of women who later they argued, they wrote about as belonging to these different categories of women in the Shtetls who performed certain functions, not only in a single community, but in multiple. They found these kinds of women in multiple communities. One of the most important categories of women, Jewish women, was the exorcist or healer. Opsprecherke in Yiddish. So someone who would cast spells, someone who you would go to if you had the evil eye, which was an extremely common belief in these communities. And Ansky documented a lot of traditions connected to the evil eye. Someone you would go to if you wanted someone to fall in love with you. Someone you would go to if you wanted someone to stop being in love with you. There's a whole range of things that you would go to these women for. And Ansky noted that the women were much more popular than the male healers in the communities that he visited. In addition, the Jewish women healers, and I say I'm using healers and exorcists because, nowadays, many of us, at least, perhaps most of us on this call, think about the etiology, the origin of diseases as, they might have a genetic basis. They might be due to different kinds of infection, whether it's a fungal infection, a bacterial infection, a viral infection. We all know about viral infections now, right? Well, in those communities, the traditional view of where many diseases came from was being possessed by a bad spirit or having the evil eye on you. And therefore, to be cured of that disease or to prevent something from happening, you had to go to a kind of an exorcist. The women exorcists, the Jewish women exorcists, would often use spells in Yiddish, or would typically use spells in Yiddish or in Ukrainian, if they were in areas where there were a lot of Ukrainians lived. Whereas the male healers would often use spells that were in Hebrew or Aramaic. Now, one of the things that's interesting about that is that the spells in Yiddish and Ukrainian, especially the ones in Yiddish, would have been comprehensible to the people being treated, whereas the ones in Hebrew and Aramaic would have not been, because most people, even the ones who were educated, if they could read it, but most people could not necessarily understand the Hebrew or especially Aramaic if it was being recited. So I want to read a passage from one of their attempts to record one of these women exorcists while she was performing her healing. So this is from that memoir that I mentioned before by Avram Rechtman. And he writes, almost every shtetl in Ukraine had its old women whom people went to for advice in times of crisis and for healing. These women performed magic with knives, socks, and combs. They poured wax and poached eggs and knew hundreds of ways to cure a patient. We employed strategies to get these old women to tell us their charms. Sometimes one of us would pretend to be ill, take to bed, and call for the healer. And actually, one of the things that's most interesting about Ansky's ethnographic work was that they would often pretend to be people that they weren't. For example, they might pretend to be traveling musicians, or they might pretend to be, in this case, somebody who's ill or somebody who's poor, who needed help. The one thing they didn't want to come across as was ethnographers, whatever that was, because no one knew what that was. In fact, some of you may not know what that is, but even now, an ethnographer is someone who, I should have explained, is someone who often it's anthropologists, but it's people who go into a community to study the life of the community, typically the sort of daily life of a community, and they stay there for a while. It could be a few days, it could be even a year or more, and record and document that life. And ethnos means people, and graph means to write. So it's people who write about the life of a people. And this is what Ansky and his team was doing. So Rehman continues, another member of the expedition would generally sit in a corner trying to write down everything he heard while the photographer took pictures. So try to imagine this scene. Often Ansky would go to one of these old healers and complain that he was suffering continual bad luck. He told them that he had once been a rich man, a merchant, and now, alas, he told them that he was poor, fallen on hard times without an income. And having explained why he had come to ask her for help, he would ask her to give him some kind of magic spell to help him to find a living. Ansky was always careful to mention that he was not looking for charity, but ready to pay for his services. His broken voice and his straightforward story nearly always produced the desired result. The old woman would get caught up in the story and start to pity her client, hoping later to be able to ask for more money. This was how they made their living. Having haggled over the price, the old woman would reveal her secret spell and Ansky would write it down. And in fact, in these memoirs, Ansky preserved and his fellow ethnographers preserved a number of these incantations. I want to mention one other class of women that I found really interesting in learning about before we turn to the questionnaire that was a lot of the inspiration for Debra Olin's artwork that you can see in the exhibition at the museum. And this category of women was very common in the Shtetls of Eastern Europe, and it was called Klogmutter, and it meant a professional, it really means like a whale mother, meaning a professional woman mourner. So in many of these communities, the cemetery was located in the town, not on the outskirts. You didn't have to drive all the way to Queens somewhere or to New Jersey, if you're in the New York area where there'd be giant cemeteries with different no, you'd have the cemetery really right in town. And it was a place, and this is actually a really key thing to understand about Eastern European Jewish life, traditional Jewish life, is that the cemetery was not some place that was out there that maybe you visited once a year and out of sight, out of mind. It was actually a place that was one of the central places for spiritual life of the Jewish community. Why? Because people felt that the spirits of their ancestors, the neshamas in Hebrew or in Yiddish, the souls of their ancestors, actually continue to hover or have some connection to the cemetery. So much so, in fact, that there was a tradition that when orphans were going to get married, they would go to the cemetery to invite their parents to attend the wedding. And there were many religious rituals connected with the cemetery and with graves. Some of them still exist, right? Putting stones on the tombstone, on the what's called the matzeva or the matzeva, and so on. Well, one of the most common traditions it still exists in some communities, and it was very common 100 years ago in the Pale of Settlement, was that in the Jewish month of Elul, you would go to the cemetery and mourn your dead relatives. However, you would not only do this yourself, but you would pay someone to do it on your behalf. And whom would you typically pay? Would be a woman, typically an older woman or women, whose job it was to hang out at the cemetery. People would pay them, and they were expected on the spot to improvise a lament for the dead individual. And Ansky noted that it was considered an inferior performance if they used any kind of written text as a prompt. They had to do it from their heart, as it were, and do it improvisationally. And they were very expert at that. And that's how they made their living. Now, I mentioned to Sophie and Nancy when we were preparing for this, that I gave a talk a few months ago to a group of people, older people here in Santa Cruz. And I mentioned this tradition, and I said, but when Jews came to the United States from Eastern Europe, they stopped this tradition. And somebody in the audience raised her hand and said, no, they didn't. And I said, oh, okay. She said, I remember that when I was a girl in the 1920s in Chicago, there used to be these women. And when we went to the cemetery in Chicago, they would mourn on people's behalf. And I said, oh, okay, that's interesting. Thank you so much. And afterwards, I thought to myself, wait a second. She remembers this happening in Chicago in the 1920s. How old is she? And it turned out that I talked to the person who had invited me, and I mentioned this, and she said, oh yeah, that's so-and-so. She's 105. And she remembered this from her childhood. So evidently, this was something that was brought to the United States and did continue, at least for a while, in some of the immigrant Jewish communities in places like Chicago, and I'm assuming also in New York. Maybe some of you have knowledge of this too. I hope after I'm done with my remarks that you can share some of your thoughts, and if you have any questions. So now I want to move into the last part of my talk, which is going to focus on something called the Jewish ethnographic program. Das Jiddische Ethnographische Programm in Yiddish, which was a questionnaire that Ansky put together. So Ansky visited, as I mentioned, 70 different shtetls, but at a certain point, he realized that he was never going to visit all of the hundreds of shtetls that existed in the Russian Empire. So he decided to create a questionnaire that he could distribute and have people respond, send in the answers to the questionnaire. So he put together a questionnaire of over 2,000 questions, which, if any of you are social scientists, know that is a impossible task to get anyone to answer over 2,000 questions. Maybe you've gotten like a call recently about political survey, which has 5 or 6 questions. That's already hard to get people to answer. Well, this was 86 questions. What are the questions? They have to do with Jewish life all the way up to death. So it's what's called a life cycle questionnaire. And it starts with not when people are born, because in traditional Jewish community in Eastern Europe, the soul actually pre-exists the body. So the first questions have to do with what is the soul doing before it enters the body. And the last questions have to do with what happens to the soul when the physical body dies. What does the soul do? Where does it go? And so on. And so among these questions were many questions having to do with Jewish women's lives, beginning with pregnancy, continuing on to childbirth, to the role of the midwife, to how Jewish girls were treated differently than Jewish boys. Were they educated differently than Jewish boys? Did they play different games than Jewish boys, for example? Did they have different kinds of teachers than Jewish boys? And these are many of the questions that Debra incorporated into her work, literally incorporated, not just inspired, but literally incorporated into her work. So I'm going to read a few of those questions. And Sophie, maybe you can show some of the slides from Debra's work that you can see in person also at the museum at Eldridge Street. And I want to say, as a way of prefacing this work, and one of the reasons why Debra's work was so inspiring and exciting to me was because in that questionnaire that Ansky put together, he wrote that his goal in collecting Jewish folk traditions was to engage in what he described in Yiddish as Aufleben, a word that means something like revive or even Renaissance. He wanted to create a renaissance of Jewish culture. And what did he mean by that? Ansky had come to the conclusion, remember, he was a political radical. He was a socialist revolutionary. And when he started, he was someone who rejected traditional Jewish culture. But later in life, he realized that rather than rejecting Jewish culture, what he and others should try to do was to create a modern Jewish culture that was rooted in Jewish tradition. And the best way of doing that was to go and find folk traditions that could then be incorporated and given new life in new art forms, in new Jewish art and cultural forms, whether it was Jewish music, whether it was Jewish theater, whether it was fine art, and so on. And so I would say that what Debra has done in her work is really to take that kind of that call that Ansky issued a century ago, now it's 110 years ago, and to literally incorporate his questionnaire, which the questions themselves, as you'll see, are about Jewish folklore, into new art, which is beautiful art in its own right, and also profoundly Jewish art. And so really it's coming full circle to the kind of vision that Ansky articulated all those years ago. So this is Debra, and actually what she's doing is, if you can read Yiddish, or even if you can't, you'll see that these are Yiddish. Yiddish is written in Hebrew letters. This is Yiddish text that comes from the questionnaire. These are some of the questions from the questionnaire. And maybe, Sophie, you can go to the next one. And there's Debra in her studio. I assume that's in Massachusetts. Next one. And this is the exhibition at the museum at Eldridge Street. And you can see how the questions are on these garments. Maybe the next one. Okay, so let's stop here for a second. So I am going to just read a few of these questions having to do with childbirth and actually having to do with pregnancy first. And you'll see here the fetus there, and you'll see these hands and the text from, I can't read the question actually, unfortunately here, but I was able to read them before. And if you go to see the exhibition, you'll be able to see it more closely. The belief that hands in Jewish tradition are often associated with protective function. Whether it's in terms of giving a blessing or warding off an evil eye. And pregnancy, the time of pregnancy, was seen as a particularly danger-filled time for the mother and the child. And so you will see in a few of the other slides, maybe you could, Sophie, you can go to the next one. And even the next one. You'll see here, some of the images here are of, maybe the next one, protective amulets, figures that can protect the mother and the child during this period. It was also a time of opportunity. What do I mean by that? Not just because the child was going to be born, but also because people in the Shtetls believed that you could potentially influence the outcome of the child while the woman was pregnant. So, for example, one of the questions is, are there signs that indicate whether a woman is pregnant with a boy or a girl? Is there a belief that if a pregnant woman sleeps a lot, it's a sign that she will give birth to a girl? Are there special means to influence whether a child in the mother's belly will be a boy or a girl? Are twins considered to be a blessing or a punishment? Is there a belief that if a woman eats a double nut, so a nut that has two different kind of, the shell that has two different nuts inside of it, she will give birth to twins? Is there a common belief that the appearance and resemblance of children depend on what the mother sees during the time that she is leaving the mikvah, which is a ritual bath, and during her pregnancy? And therefore, a pregnant woman should not look at impure animals and foul, sinful or evil people, or at ugly pictures. So these are just some of the questions that Ansky asked about about pregnancy that also make their way, some of them at least, into Debra's work. Maybe you can go to the next one, Sophie. There are also many questions about midwives. The midwife was an incredibly important role in Jewish communities and obviously in other communities as well, at a time when women did not go to doctors or hospitals to give birth. Most births, the vast majority, were at home. Even when doctors became available and hospitals became available in some larger cities for people to give birth in, most people avoided them like the plague, because they felt like hospitals were a place where people went to die rather than to be born, and that they were dangerous places. And so the vast majority of people were not only born at home, but with the help of a midwife. And so the role of a midwife, which was always a woman, was very important. And here are just a couple of questions connected to that. What does a midwife usually receive for her efforts? What gifts do people give her, and who gives them? Is there a custom, and this one I really like a lot, that when the midwife dies, all of the children whom she brought into the world accompany her funeral procession with candles in their hands? Should be an incredible image. Okay, well, there's many more questions, hundreds of questions. This is a copy of the book. I translated the questionnaire, as Nancy mentioned, and I published a book where I provide some context for the questionnaire. There's hundreds of questions on Jewish women's life and experiences that I can't get to today. I would encourage you to get the book, to read the questionnaire if you're interested in that, and then of course also to visit the museum and to see Debra's luminous work in person, if you want to see how she created new art, with not only inspired, of course, by the questionnaire, but also by the Jewish traditions and folk life and women's experiences that lie behind the questionnaire. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm happy to take any questions. And I see that maybe some people would also like to hear from Debra. I can't speak for her, but maybe she would be willing to answer some questions too. And thank you very much, all of you, for being here. I'm sorry we can't do it in person, but on the other hand, I see people from Seattle and Evanston and Charlottesville and so on, and that wouldn't have been possible probably if we had done it in person. So thank you once again, Nancy and Sophie, and thank all of you.
Thank you so much, Nathaniel. I've just learned so much, and it's just, I can't wait to read more of the questions. We do have quite a few questions coming in, but the first question that I have for you, Nathaniel, is if you can talk a little bit about how you got into this research in the first place.
So the way I got into this research was because I was writing a book, doing research for a book on a woman called the Maiden of Ludmir, die Ludmir Moed in Yiddish. She was a Jewish holy woman. She's considered to be the only woman in the history of Judaism that was a Hasidic Rebbe, that functioned like a Hasidic Rebbe. Hasidism is this pietistic Jewish movement that started in Eastern Europe in the 1700s and then spread throughout Eastern Europe. And then eventually Hasidim came to the United States and Israel and elsewhere. Many of them live in Brooklyn now, for example, in Crown Heights, in Borough Park, in Williamsburg. And they have these leaders who are almost invariably 99.9% of the time men, but in the 19th century, in a town in what's now Ukraine, at the time it was the Russian Empire, called Ludmir, there was a woman who served as a Hasidic Rebbe, which was very controversial at the time. And I wrote a book about her. And in writing that book, I became interested in Jewish women's lives in Shtetls. And I also became interested in Ansky, because one of the questions in this questionnaire is about the Maiden of Ludmir. He was interested in seeing whether people in the various towns that he visited and where he sent the questionnaire knew about her and knew any legends or stories about her. And so it was really through becoming interested in her that I became interested in the topic of Jewish folklore and ethnography, but also specifically Jewish women's lives, including women who, unlike her, people don't even know about, right? We don't know their names in many cases, right? Like the vast majority of most people, men and women, but they served really important functions in their communities often. And they did a lot of extraordinary things, and that's what I'm trying to reconstruct.
And of the questionnaire that Ansky sent out, how many responses did he actually get? Do you know?
So I didn't answer that. I didn't mention that because he didn't actually get any responses. What happened was, for those of you who know this time period, World War I started. And World War I started right when he was doing this ethnographic work in the Pale of Settlement, which happened to be the war zone. It was the Eastern Front. That was became another name for it. And what ended up happening is that he had to stop the ethnographic research, and the people whom he was sending the questionnaire to had other things to do than answer the questionnaire. And unfortunately, this was a time of incredible violence that was experienced, and many hundreds of thousands of Jews became refugees. There's a new book actually about the pogroms in this period and a little bit later by somebody named Jeffrey Weidlinger that I would recommend people get if you're interested in that. Probably a few 100,000 Jews, maybe up to a few 100,000 Jews were actually murdered in this time in the violent outbreaks. So, and Ansky actually shifted from being an ethnographer to, I didn't mention one other hat that he wore, which was a relief worker. He started to help the refugees and to try to get relief to them in different kinds. So the questionnaire was never answered. I'll just say two more things about that. One is that the questions themselves are full of incredible detail, and it's likely that the questions actually reflect practices that they knew existed. They just wanted to find out whether they existed in a particular town, whether they existed in the past, or whether the people still do it, or whether there's some variation. So for example, the question that I said that I really liked about when a midwife dies, do all the people whom she delivered go through the town, make a procession in her funeral holding candles? Well, that happened in some places. So it wasn't like he was just randomly coming up with questions. The questions actually reflect beliefs and practices. He was really interested in seeing whether those were widespread or only in a handful of communities per se, or maybe 100 years ago they existed and now they don't because of modernization, assimilation, etc. So the questions themselves are really valuable source of information even without answers.
Someone actually has a question about the graves. We have a grad student who has been doing research on the women who used to measure the cemetery and graves
Yes.
to make the special soul candles. And this person is wondering if you found any links between them and the Clogerans. Were there women who practiced both? Were they separate?
Right. So I didn't mention that, although I alluded to it. So there were a number of practices having to do with measuring graves or even measuring cemeteries, where you would take a string and measure a grave or measure a cemetery. Then you would cut it and turn it into wick for candles that were used also for mourning or memorial rituals. And that's a really good question, whether that was linked to the these professional mourners, these women. And I asked that too, and I have not found that, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was some connection between them, and maybe somebody here knows and has seen it. To some extent, it's like a needle, and I mean, some things are well documented, and some things are more like a needle in a haystack, except that sometimes you ask someone who was there or who had a grandparent or parent that was there, and they'll say something, and it'll be just, yeah, of course, that's the way it was. You don't know, so it could be my own ignorance, but I haven't come across a source that mentions that link.
Thank you. And we have another comment from someone, Barry Feldman, who says, it seems that some women are feminine counterparts to Baal Shem Tovim. Comment?
So that's a good question. So there was a male figure called Baal Shem, and the plural is Baal Shem. That means like master of the name. And the name is the name of God, or the holy names of God, which there's a very long Jewish tradition of using names of God for magical purposes because they have a lot of power. And the most famous of these Baal Shem is the Baal Shem Tov, who's considered to be the founder of the Hasidic movement. But there were many others. And that is true, that to some degree, these women that I've been describing are performing some of the same functions that the Baal Shem do. So there are some male, and I didn't mention another category of woman, which is the Zogerka, or for Zogren, which means the one who reads before. And these were women who were better educated than most of the women in their communities and could read. And they were prayer leaders for other women. And they would either pray on behalf of other women or help other women with their prayers. And they were common too. So we have male kind of counterparts too, although men, typically Jewish men, could pray, could read prayers. But there are prayer leaders, male prayer leaders, and these would be women prayer leaders, because in these synagogues, the men and the women were separated from one another. And so men are on one side, women on the other, or men above, men below, women above, depending on the architecture of the synagogue. You would have women leading prayers. So yes, there are a lot of counterparts. There are also some functions that would just be performed by women.
And I want to take this moment now. There are a couple of questions that are actually directed to Debra. And I wonder if Debra, you feel comfortable in muting yourself to answer some of these questions that are about your work, specifically about your choice of medium in your work, whether or not printmaking and these collages was somewhat, purposeful or meaningful in the content of the content itself.
Hi, I unmuted myself.
Hi, Debra.
Can you hear me? Oh, okay, good. Yes. Well, I think I went to printmaking because I'm a printmaker, and that was a natural place to jump off from. Also, I think because of the being able to use the same image over and over, a lot of the work has garments in it, which I can, depending on how many times you run the garment through the press or the residual ink from when you take the garment off, gives a different feeling. And so using the image of the ultrasound, which I kind of thought of as a contemporary amulet, a way of feeling safe, that the child was safe. It just became an easy way to repeat an image, and no decision really negates another. So once you have these pieces, these puzzle pieces in front of you, what happens if you try it this way? What happens if you do that? You don't have to, as maybe in painting, once you put the brush down, that's your stroke and that's what you've decided, that's your color. With printmaking and collage, you can keep trying things. And so you can kind of see from print to print that the same image is used over and over, but in a different way. So I guess that's.
And of all of the questions, 2,000 plus questions, which ones were you really focused on? And while you talk, I'm going to start sharing the screen again to showcase the remaining works that we haven't been able to share yet. Debra?
I would say the questions are really dangerous because the more I read them, the more I want to do with them. But I don't know, they're just certain questions jumped out at me. And there's a question about, is it considered bad luck to hold a child in front of a mirror before it gets its first teeth? I mean, it seemed just like in some ways so obscure, and other ways, I don't know, it was almost, there's just something about it that that really drew me in. There were some, about what games and songs and dances do people teach a child, what to a girl, what to a boy, things about whether it's, I don't know, is it better for the pregnant woman if no one knows of her condition? I can't really say why, and I used some questions over and over again, but it just some questions jumped out at me, and that's what I went with. And like I said, there's a lot more. I could spend the rest of my life doing this, I guess, if I wanted to.
Thank you, Debra. I mean, it's really so incredible. I want to turn some of the questions back to Nathaniel, since we are running out of time. Some folks were wondering whether or not the roles that the women served were hereditary. For example, if a woman was a midwife, would her daughter be a midwife as well? Was there any knowledge from the research that you did?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's one of the questions that Ansky had, especially about midwives. Yeah, and also whether midwives had to be older women or not. Whether you could have a non-Jewish midwife, whether you could have a non-Jewish wet nurse. That's a big question. That's not only in Jewish society, but you see that in other communities, traditional communities, because there was a belief in a number of communities that certain qualities are transmitted through the milk. So, like I said before, one of the things that you see in Eastern European Jewish society, traditional society, is the notion that pregnancy and childhood, early childhood especially, are these times of great danger and possibility. Great danger that has to be protected against using amulets, incantations against the evil eye. For example, traditionally, you wouldn't say, "Oh, what a beautiful baby." You would say, "What an ugly baby," because you don't want to attract the evil eye to the beauty of the baby. You don't want to do anything that will attract the evil eye. So you won't say, "Oh, wow, you're looking really great." It's a no.
Unwanted
if you
attention.
do, then you have to say Kenahara, against the evil eye, Kenain Hara, Kenahara, to ward off the evil eye. So imagine a world, but at the same time, right, you can shape the baby in utero and also the infant in all sorts of ways that we wouldn't imagine that we could necessarily. Although, interestingly enough, now, there are other approaches to, how much, you should play music, you should do math, you should do this, you should do that, right? So in a way, our own society is one in which we've returned to the notion in a kind of different way to how impressionable both fetuses and young children might be, even if many of us at least don't believe in spirits and evil eye and so on.
And you also mentioned, well, actually I have two questions for you, two-part question. You mentioned that there were recordings that were made and there were photographs that were taken. Where can people find that information or those images now? And where did his works end up going? How did people find these works? Where are they now?
Yeah. Let me also say, I don't know whether the healers and the professional mourners, whether those were functions that were passed from mother to daughter. It's a good question. My guess is that the healers, probably. The mourners, maybe less so. That tended to be kind of virtuosic and really older women who were, may have been more dependent on their kind of performative ability, whereas the healers, a lot of it had to do with knowledge and incantations that I think were probably more likely to be passed down the way that medical knowledge, certainly traditional medical knowledge, can be passed down from one generation to the next. In terms of the materials themselves, well, because of the war, because of the Russian Revolution, A lot of these materials were scattered, and they were scattered to different sites around what was the Soviet Union, in Kiev, St. Petersburg, Minsk, and then some of the materials ended up in YIVO, which is this, the world's greatest repository of Eastern European Jewish materials, cultural materials, literary materials, now in New York, made its way to New York, and is now in New York. And so there's, after the Soviet Union collapsed, people started to be able to recover some of these materials or discover them, rediscover them. And so some of the music, for example, is in Kiev. Some of the photos are in St. Petersburg. So it is possible to access some of these, and some of the letters and other written materials, for example, are in Kiev and what's called the Vernadsky Library and in YIVO. So it is possible to get access to some of the materials today.
And I think that's all we have time for today. Nathaniel, if you can, while I say goodbye to everyone, write down in the chat box the name of some of the books. We have quite a few people who've been asking about the books that you were recommending. And I want to thank you so much for tuning in all the way from California with us today. And I want to thank our audiences as well for just the amount of questions that you had were wonderful. And I know that we can continue this conversation on and on, but I do invite you to come see the exhibition if you can in New York City. It closes in April 24th. And before we close, we do have a final program that coincides with the exhibit, and it's going to be a concert on April 10th featuring a Brooklyn-based violinist whom NPR has considered one of the finest klezmer fiddlers on the planet. And this concert will explore what they were calling the sonic world of the Ansky expedition of 1912 to 1914. And this is in partnership with the Center for Traditional Music and Dance's Ansky Institute for Yiddish Culture. So I hope that you will sign up for that program if you are local. It is going to be in person, and we're really excited about it. So you can sign up by checking out our website, and we will be recording. We did record this program, so if there's anything that you want to go back to, you'll be able to check that out in about a week. So thank you all again, and stay safe, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful evening. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nathaniel. Thank you.